He walked slowly to the electric chair. The chains on his wrists didn't shake, his eyes remained fixed, cold, as if staring at something no one else could see. And then he smiled, a faint, strange, out-of-place smile. As if, in that final moment, he knew something that no one there would ever discover. And when the electric current coursed through his body, he left without saying a single word. An absolute silence. No confession, no explanation. Just a riddle, the mortal secret he took with him to the end. It's hard to forget the faces of the condemned, but this was different. Not because of the crime itself, but because of the mystery that surrounded it, until the very last second. His gaze seemed to carry a truth that slipped through the hands of justice, the press, and even the investigators themselves, a look that seemed to say, "You will never understand." And maybe they didn't. After all, how could someone accused of such a brutal crime smile with such serenity seconds before dying? Have you ever felt that? The sense that there's something about a story that doesn't add up, a detail out of place, an absence that speaks louder than 1,000 words. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This is not just a case of crime, it's a portrait of a disturbing silence that cries out for answers even after everything is over. The crime shook an entire city. A young woman brutally murdered in her home. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, just a trail of blood and a single suspect, him. An ordinary man with no criminal record, no history of violence, but who was arrested based on circumstances that for many seemed sufficient, for others are too fragile. The trial was swift. The headlines plastered his face daily. Yet at no point and not once did he open his mouth to defend himself. No tears, no justification, just that silence. And that's where criminal psychology comes into play. What leads someone, in the face of an opportunity to prove their innocence, to choose absolute silence? Is it fear, guilt, coldness, or something deeper? Perhaps loyalty, manipulation, or even a desperate attempt to uphold a dark pact. His behavior defied any pattern. It was as if he wasn't there to fight, but rather to play a role, as if accepting death was less painful than revealing the truth. It's not uncommon for a defendant's silence to say more than any speech, but when that silence is accompanied by a smile, everything changes. The human mind seeks meaning, explanations, logic. But what happens when all the answers die with those who could provide them? Was he really guilty, or was he just covering for someone? Or worse? Did he enjoy what he did and the smile was his final signature? In a society obsessed with answers, the mystery of this man became unbearable for many. Jurors left the courtroom with more doubts than certainties. The victim's family never found peace. And the investigators, well, to this day, some claim that something about that final scene haunts them. That smile wasn't for nothing, that it said something and something that escaped everyone. Perhaps the scariest part isn't the crime itself, but the fact that the truth may have died there before everyone without anyone even noticing. And it's at this point that our story begins to delve deeper, because behind that smile, there exists a dark psychological trail. Because behind that smile, there exists a dark psychological trail, a hidden layer that we are still trying to decipher. And perhaps that's precisely what disturbs us the most. The idea that the truth doesn't always appear in words. Sometimes it hides in silence, in a gaze, or in a simple, enigmatic gesture like an out-of-place smile. Now tell me, what about you? What did you feel when imagining this scene? Does this type of silence make you think of something you've seen, heard, or even experienced? If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment about what touched you the most so far. It could be a question, an impression, or even a personal experience. Your voice matters. And rest assured, it helps many others who are also trying to understand the mysteries of the human mind and the emotions that justice doesn't always manage to explain. Also, take a moment to like this video if in any way it captivated you, made you reflect, or sparked a new curiosity. It shows us that it's worth continuing to bring such strong, real content that provokes profound discussions about the nature of crime, silence, and the psychology behind judgments. And if this is The type of content you want to see more of here? Subscribe to the channel. Your participation is what allows this space to grow and reach more people who are also interested in such intense and important themes. All of this, your comment, your like, your subscription, truly makes a difference. Not only to keep this project alive, but to spread reflections that often remain tucked away in the files of the system. Here, we bring it to light, and what comes next may deepen this mystery even further. The case exploded like a bomb in the headlines. A young woman brutally murdered inside her home, on a quiet street in a neighborhood that seemed untouched by violence. There was no forced entry, no screams, no neighbor heard or saw anything unusual. It was as if the crime had happened within a vacuum, quick, silent, ruthless. The victim was found on the living room floor, showing signs of struggle, but with one disturbing detail. A broken necklace carefully placed on the table, as if it were a message, a symbol. To this day, no one knows exactly what that meant. The city reacted as if it had been wounded in the heart. The press didn't relent. All the newspapers featured photos of the victim, speculations about her personal life, and most importantly, the face of the accused. An ordinary man with no criminal record, a public servant, a neighbor for many years. Suddenly, he became public enemy number one, the monster hidden under the mask of routine. But there was something there that didn't fit, a missing piece. The kind of detail that disturbs, that makes you return and look at the scene again, trying to understand what's wrong. Even with all the popular pressure and the collective desire for justice, investigators struggled to close the case easily. The evidence was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints on the murder weapon, no witnesses, just a series of coincidences that together seemed to condemn him. He had been near the victim's house that night. They knew each other. They exchanged sporadic messages. But so what? How many people do the same every day and would never commit murder? The issue is that in the face of fear, outrage, and collective emotion, the pursuit of truth is often overshadowed by the need for a culprit. And when society demands quick answers, the process becomes a spectacle. The trial was public, broadcast live, and every gesture of the accused was interpreted, analyzed, distorted. His silence was read as coldness, his calm gaze as arrogance, his final smile as a provocation. But what if he was trying to say something that no one wanted to hear? What's curious is that there were details in the crime scene that seemed out of place but were ignored. A freshly used coffee cup in the sink, even though the victim wasn't a fan of coffee. An open book on a page that didn't correspond to the time of day she was found. Small clues that could suggest another presence there, another narrative. But all of this was erased by the force of social judgment, by the media's hunger for a quick verdict. The impact was profound. People who once lived there peacefully began to lock their doors in broad daylight. Families moved away. Children started asking if the smiling man was a real villain. But no one talked about what really mattered. What if the hidden truth was precisely in the most ignored detail? Now I want to dive even deeper into this subject, because when we look at the background of this trial and the small ignored signs, we begin to realize that this case is not just about a crime. It's about how we deal with fear, with rushed decisions, and with what we choose to believe. It's about what we let slip while thinking we already understand everything. Comment below. This makes sense to me. He was the kind of person no one noticed. He had worked the same job for over 10 years, adhered to schedules, greeted neighbors with a discreet wave, and maintained an almost impeccable routine. He didn't drink, didn't attend parties, had no history of conflicts or any sign that could raise a red flag. He was polite, cordial, but at the same time, inaccessible. A silent presence felt only by the absence of any striking emotional traits. Many described him as reserved. Others, over time, began to say there was something strange about that constant silence, as if he were always hiding something, even if no one knew exactly what. During the trial, this trait became even more evident. As witnesses became emotional, the victim's family cried, and the prosecutors pressed with harsh words, he remained motionless, not in denial, not in despair, but in a sort of neutral, almost clinical state. His eyes didn't stray. But they didn't convey anything either. No guilt, no remorse, no anger. It was as if he was simply watching everything happen, like someone watching a play already knowing the ending. And it was precisely this neutrality that caused the most discomfort. Because when someone doesn't react, when they don't show, when they don't defend themselves, everything can seem possible. Some forensic psychiatrists have assessed his demeanor as compatible with traits of severe emotional detachment, a characteristic common in certain antisocial profiles. But nothing was clearly diagnosed. No report was conclusive. It was like trying to catch smoke. There was something there, yes, but it wouldn't be held. The hidden truth seemed to lurk in the subtext of his behavior. A slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a subtle tightening of his hands, a silent sigh after hearing the verdict. Details that went unnoticed by many, but perhaps carried the full weight of what he didn't say. The transformation of public. Perception about him was brutal. Previously, he was the quiet man in the neighborhood. Then he became a walking mystery, a living enigma. And the question that echoed was always the same. Was he a dissimulated psychopath, trained to deceive, with a calm face? Or was he an innocent trapped inside his own mind, unable to react to the weight of an accusation he didn't know how to combat? It is at this point that criminal psychology finds its most unstable ground. The area where appearances deceive, where coldness can be trauma and silence a shield. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we start to observe not just external behavior, but the emotional backstory behind each gesture, the story takes on another form. The form of an internal journey where silent decisions and invisible scars shape an entire narrative, even if no one is paying attention. And it is precisely in this invisible field that the greatest impact can occur. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." During the interrogations, what stood out most was not the words he said, but those he left unsaid. The responses always came slowly, spaced by long silences that left the investigators more uneasy than any confession. When asked what he was doing on the night of the crime, he would stare blankly at the wall, take a deep breath and respond vaguely with something like, "I was at home," without detail, without hesitation, but also without convincing anyone. It was as if he were following an internal script, carefully calculated not to say too much nor too little, just enough to not implicate himself and leave everyone lost. His body language didn't help either. He didn't sweat, he didn't tremble, he didn't avert his gaze. He showed no anger or desperation, not even when the police slammed their hands on the table or raised their voices. One of the detectives even said it was like interrogating a wall, inert, impassive, almost inhumanly calm. At certain moments, he would let out a slight smile, not wide enough to seem sarcastic, but subtle enough to make everything more disturbing, as if he knew something others didn't, as if he was enjoying the psychological game, or perhaps as if that smile were a shield against a pain too profound to be expressed in words. The most disconcerting thing is that even in the face of such serious accusations, he showed no indignation. He didn't try to defend himself vehemently. He didn't cry out for justice. No tears, no outbursts, no gestures of outrage. And this is where the discomfort arises. Because the absence of emotion in moments of extreme tension messes with our perception of humanity. We expect reactions, we expect breakdowns, loss of control, shouts. But when all we receive is silence and neutrality, our brain doesn't know how to interpret it. Is it coldness, guilt, or a deep defense mechanism rooted in traumas that have yet to be revealed? Now imagine for a second what this caused the victim's mother. Sitting there, on the other side of the glass, watching the man accused of killing her daughter act as if he were in a common meeting, without remorse, without empathy, without even bowing his head. What goes through a mother's mind in the face of this? How to move forward without even the slightest explanation? Because at the end of the day, the cruelest pain is not just the loss. It's the absence of meaning. It's looking into the eyes of someone who may have destroyed your life and finding absolutely nothing there. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because silence, as uncomfortable as it may be, carries stories. Stories that often scream inside while the world outside demands words. And it is in this abyss between what is said and what is felt that the truth may hide, sometimes forever. Comment. This makes sense to me. The trial began surrounded by expectations. The cameras were on, the audience seats were full, and the press already had their headlines ready. Everyone wanted an answer, an end, a conviction that would relieve the key collective tension. But as the evidence began to be presented, an uncomfortable sensation spread. There was nothing concrete. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. What existed was a sequence of coincidences and circumstances interpreted as indications, and even those indications, when analyzed coldly, raised more questions than certainties. A smudged footprint on the sidewalk, compatible with his shoe size. A call made from the victim's cell phone the day before to his number. That was never returned. And a security camera that captured him a few blocks away, hours before the crime. That was it. No objects in the house showed signs of his presence. No threatening messages, no evident motive. But for the jury, for the media, and for society, that was enough. The absence of clear evidence was compensated by something even more powerful: the absence of emotion. Throughout the trial, he remained the same way he had during the interrogations: silent, firm, impenetrable. And it was precisely this demeanor that weighed as if it were evidence. Because in the collective mentality, someone who does not react as we expect can only be hiding something. This was the invisible key of the process. He was not convicted just for what he did, but for what he failed to demonstrate. Coldness, silence, constant gaze. All of this was interpreted as guilt. The hidden truth might not have been in the facts, but in the expressions, or rather in their absence. And this is where we need to reflect more deeply. Because there are judgments that do not happen inside the courtroom, they happen in people's minds. The emotional impact of a defendant who does not cry, does not defend himself, does not plead, is much greater than it appears. The public does not just want justice, they want a story that makes sense. And if the behavior does not fit this emotional script, it becomes suspect. Deep down, it's as if we are all constantly judging based on the emotions we project onto others. And this is dangerous, because it turns justice into a stage and the trial into a spectacle. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we start to deconstruct the decisions we make based on appearance and behavior, we realize how much we are influenced by unconscious triggers, and how much this can define someone's fate, even if the evidence suggests otherwise. Comment. I'm on this journey too. Silence in the universe of criminal psychology is never just an absence of sound. It can be a muffled scream, a defense mechanism, or even a calculated strategy. When someone refuses to speak in the face of such a grave accusation, the tendency is to think of immediate guilt. But this interpretation, as instinctive as it may be, can be far from the truth. Experts like Robert Hare, one of the leading names in the study of psychopathy, explain that individuals with psychopathic traits often do not feel the same kind of guilt or fear that shapes the behavior of most. For them, the idea of remaining silent does not come from despair, but from control. This type of mind operates differently. Silence can be a form of power, a mental game where the absence of words is more provocative than any argument. There are records of similar cases where criminals maintained silence until the last moment. Edmund Kemper, for example, only began to speak after he voluntarily turned himself in, and even then he carefully chose what to reveal. Israel Keyes, one of the most methodical killers in the US, controlled his narrative with disconcerting pauses, calculated responses, and long periods of complete mutism. But not all silence is psychopathic. In some cases, it stems from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of leaving a gap, or in more complex cases, fear of betraying something greater, a hidden truth, a pact, an old trauma. And that is when silence stops being merely absence and starts to become presence. It fills space, it screams, it disturbs. Because in the absence of explanations, everyone fills the void with their own interpretation. And this is the perfect ground for distorted judgments and hasty decisions. The most curious thing is that, even with all the modern tools of behavioral science, it is still difficult to decipher silence. Studies from universities like Stanford and Harvard have tried to identify clear patterns, but the human subjectivity escapes statistics. An individual may appear cold and silent due to traits of neurodivergence, extreme introversion, or even due to being in shock. And when we ignore these possibilities, we risk transforming an incomprehensible behavior into a moral verdict. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the way we interpret silence says much more about our collective mentality than about who is being judged. It reveals our fears, our need for immediate explanation, and how we deal with what escapes our control. Instead of listening to the silence, we try to fill it, even if it's with wrong assumptions. What if his silence was never a shield, but a promise? What if in that final smile, there was more than just provocation or disdain? There was loyalty. This is one of the theories that intrigues those who delve into the background of this case. The possibility that he did not act alone, or worse, that he was never the perpetrator of the crime, but rather someone who chose to take on the role of the defendant willingly. The idea might seem absurd at first glance, but it gains strength when certain patterns in his behavior are observed. The exaggerated calm, the absence of defense, the acceptance of fate as if he already knew that it was part of a greater plan. The psychology of extreme loyalty, especially when associated with relationships marked by profound emotional imbalances, is a little explored, yet real, field. There are records of individuals who took the blame for crimes to protect someone they loved, or to whom they owed some kind of emotional debt. It's a mindset that escapes rational logic and plunges into an internal journey marked by submission, sacrifice, and often inherited guilt. This doesn't mean he was innocent, but perhaps if guilty, he was not the only one. And then the focus of the story completely shifts. Another detail that supports this line of thought is the behavior during the trial. At several moments, he would avert his gaze when certain questions were asked. He did not show discomfort with the accusations, but seemed to tense up when the name of a specific person was mentioned. A woman who had been investigated but was dismissed due to lack of evidence. An ex-partner, neighbor of the victim. Coincidence or connection? We may never know for sure, because the process did not advance in that direction. But his gesture, the micro-expressing of tension, was recorded in the files. Small revelations that only those who closely follow along can perceive. And what if that smile deep down was a message, not for the investigators, not for the jurors, but for someone who was watching, someone he wanted to reassure or remind of something they had agreed upon? It could have been a silent farewell, a relief for keeping his part of the bargain, or even an intimate provocation. You know what I did for you. In those moments, the hidden truth ceases to be merely a hypothesis and transforms into a maze of decisions made in the dark, where every gesture is a clue, but none lead directly to the exit. Now I want to dive even deeper into this subject, because when we consider the possibility that the true culprit was never judged, the question shifts. It ceases to be why didn't he speak, and becomes who was he protecting and why. And in this scenario, silence is not just disturbing, it's revealing. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. The mother of the victim was never the same again. Not just because of the irreparable loss of her daughter, but because of how everything happened, the absence of a motive, a word, an explanation. She used to say that the worst part wasn't waking up every day in an empty house, nor dealing with the silence of the room that was once full of life. The worst part was remembering the face of that man in the courtroom, calmly facing everyone, without remorse, without emotion, as if all of it hadn't happened, or worse, as if it didn't matter. Sometimes what hurts the most is not death, it's the lack of an answer. The jurors were also marked. One of them, in an interview months later, confessed that he would wake up in the middle of the night mentally replaying the trial, trying to understand if they had done the right thing. He said that during the process, he felt divided. Part of him thought the defendant was indeed guilty. The other part kept asking, why doesn't he try to defend himself? Why does he accept everything with that empty gaze? In the end, he voted for conviction, but admitted he could never sleep like before. Because there is a type of guilt that arises not from doing wrong, but from not being sure if what was done was right. The investigators themselves felt the weight of the case for a long time. One of them, now retired, said that it was the only file he could never close emotionally. He said there was something about the crime scene that felt incomplete, like a piece misplaced, a detail ignored due to pressure, fatigue, or the desire to give a quick answer to society, and that every time he remembered the defendant's smile, before dying, he felt a mixture of discomfort and frustration. Because there was truth there, but it was hidden beneath layers of silence and hasty decisions. It's important to understand that when a case like this happens, it doesn't end with the verdict. It continues in the minds of those involved, transforming into shadows, into background noise. It changes the way each of them sees the world, justice, guilt. The psychological transformation is profound. For the mother, it became endless mourning. For the jurors, permanent doubt. For the investigators, a sense of incomplete task. And for those who observe from the outside, a story that disturbs precisely because it does not offer closure. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when scars come not from actions but from their absence, pain settles in a subtler and crueler way. And this changes everything, the way we seek meaning, how we construct justice, and how we learn to live with what may never be explained. Comment below. This makes sense to me. The case was closed, the defendant convicted, the sentence served. To the end, and the files archived. Officially, there was nothing more to be done, but the air was still heavy. The city returned to its routine, the newspapers shifted focus, names were erased from headlines, but the story did not end there. Because there is something that even a court cannot bury: doubt. And this doubt continues to echo in the silences of families, in the memories of jurors, in the whispered conversations of those who followed everything closely. The body was buried, but the truth, perhaps it was never found. This is where we need to stop and ask, can we really call this justice? When a trial does not bring peace, when those involved leave more confused than they entered, when the feeling of incompleteness lingers for years, is this justice or merely a concluded procedure? There is a brutal distance between verdict and truth, and the problem is that often we confuse one for the other simply because we need closure. But official closure doesn't mean the story made sense. It only means someone was punished. And that in itself does not bring healing. Behind the scenes of justice, there are countless cases like this, where everything seems resolved, yet no one can move on. Where there are more questions than answers, more hypotheses than facts. And the most frightening part is realizing how much we tolerate this. How much we normalize the idea that if there was a blamed party, then it's better to accept and move on. Even when his silence still resonates, even when the evidence doesn't support the weight of the conviction, even when the eyes of the victims have never seen remorse or confession, and when the truth is suffocated, whether by accident or convenience, the system loses more than credibility. It loses humanity. Because at its core, justice isn't about finding someone to blame. It's about finding meaning. And when that meaning is absent, a void remains, a space where pain settles and the mind always returns to the same point. Did we do the right thing? Did we understand everything wrong? Did we let something slip by? Now I want to dive even deeper into this subject, because perhaps the greatest transformation happens not in the courtroom, but within each person touched by stories like this. Stories where silence weighs more than any evidence, where emotional impact transcends the verdict, and where what was lost was not just a life, but also the chance to understand what really happened. Comment below. This makes sense to me, he smiled. The very moment the sentence became final, in the instant when death was merely a matter of seconds. He looked ahead and smiled. It wasn't a wide grin, nor forced, nor nervous. It was one of those discreet, contained smiles that carry more meaning than 1,000 words could ever explain. A smile that, depending on the observer's perspective, could be interpreted as mockery, as peace, as a challenge, or as farewell. And it is in this small gesture, so simple yet so loaded, that perhaps the most disturbing part of this whole story is hidden. Why does someone smile in the face of the end, knowing they are about to die without having told their version of the facts? Could this be the smile of someone with nothing left to lose? Or the relief of someone who fulfilled their part in something that no one else understands? Perhaps it was a silent plea for forgiveness, a wordless acknowledgement of guilt. Or maybe a warning, a coded message to someone watching from the other side of the glass, someone who would understand that gesture as only they knew. And it is here that the mystery deepens even further, because this smile cannot be analyzed by technical reports or legal logic. It is beyond that. It touches a darker, more subjective place, the zone where truth mingles with instinct. And the most curious thing is how this detail, this moment of seconds, became the turning point in the memory of those who followed the case. Journalists remember the smile more clearly than they remember the evidence. The jurors, even years later, describe that look with hesitant voices. And the investigators, well, many say it was there they realized they might never know the truth. And what each person sees in it says more about their own beliefs, their anxieties, and their doubts than about the accused. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when a simple smile is capable of disrupting the collective perception of truth, we need to question how prepared we are to deal with what cannot be explained, with what doesn't close, with what doesn't fit into any clear ending. Perhaps that was indeed his last gesture of control, a way to ensure that, even after death, he would still leave unanswered questions. And if that's the case, did he lose? Or did he win by taking with him what no one else could decipher? If you made it this far, it's because this story has affected you in some way. And that's why it's so valuable to have you with us. This type of content requires effort, research, attention to detail, but it delivers something that goes beyond entertainment. It delivers reflection, provokes questions, and perhaps even transforms the way you see certain things. So if it made sense to you, if you truly connected with what was said, subscribe to the channel to keep following similar content, made with the same intensity and purpose. Take a moment to leave in the comments the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." That way I know you were present in every part of this journey. And of course, give it a like too. Not for the algorithm, but for everything we've built together up to this point. It shows that it's worth continuing to bring stories that challenge logic and poke at the deepest emotions. There's a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The next story could completely change what you think about guilt, truth, and silence.